The cold in the Great Lakes exclusion zone isn't a weather condition. It is a physical predator. At minus 80 degrees, the laws of biology are suspended and replaced by the laws of thermodynamics. In this world, heat is the only currency, and I am rapidly going bankrupt. My home is the lung, a reinforced geodesic hydroponic dome buried deep beneath the permafrost of what used to be the Michigan shoreline. For 3 years, I have lived here in a state of suspended animation, tending to rows of genetically hardened kale and soy under the flickering glow of UV lamps. The lung is powered by a geothermal tap, a titanium needle driven 600 feet into a volcanic fissure that provides a constant, thrumming warmth. It is the only thing that separates me from the deep freeze, a world where the air is so brittle it can shatter a human lung like a piece of thin glass. The failure happened at 4:12. I didn't need the alarm to tell me. I felt the change in the vibration of the floorboards. The deep, rhythmic heartbeat of the geothermal pump suddenly hitched, coughed a spray of metallic grit, and died. The silence that followed was terrifying. It was the silence of the grave. I rolled out of my bunk, my breath already blooming in a thick gray cloud. The internal thermometer on the wall was plummeting. 18 degrees Celsius, 15 degrees Celsius. By the time I reached the engine room, the condensation on the copper pipes had already turned to jagged needles of frost. I hammered on the regulator with a lead pipe, a desperate, primitive gesture, but the machine remained cold. The manifold, the heart of the heat exchange, had sheared clean through. If I didn't replace it, the lung would become a tomb within 6 hours. The plants would blacken and liquefy, the water lines would burst, and the coal would seep through the insulation until my very blood began to crystallize. Delta Station, I whispered, the words feeling heavy in the freezing air. Delta was a research outpost 3 miles to the northeast, sitting directly on the frozen expanse of the lake. It had been abandoned during the first flash, but its storerooms were supposed to be stocked with modular parts. 3 miles across the crust, the name we gave to the infinite, featureless plain of ice that was once Lake Michigan. I began the ritual of the suit. The thermal rig is a masterpiece of desperation. It starts with a base layer of heated wire mesh, followed by a thick skin of aerogel insulation, and capped with a pressurized outer shell of white Kevlar. I checked the lithium-sulfur battery packs. They were at 80%. In this cold, that meant I had 4 hours of active heating before the suit became a refrigerator. I grabbed my pack, a heavy-duty ice axe, and a handful of magnesium flares. I didn't take a gun. Bullets don't fire well at 80 below, and the grease in the chamber would freeze into glue anyway. I stepped into the airlock, the inner door sealed with a heavy clack. I hit the cycle button. The outer door groaned, the hydraulic fluid complaining as it fought the thickening cold. When it finally slid open, the world vanished. There was no sky, no horizon, and no sun, only the whiteout. It was a vertical sea of frozen mist and wind-driven ice crystals that scoured the visor of my helmet like sandpaper. I stepped out. My boots hit the ice with a sound like a gunshot. The crust was so cold it had the structural density of granite. It didn't crunch, it rang. I tethered a high-tension nylon line to the airlock handle and began to walk. The wind was a physical weight, a wall of invisible lead pushing against my chest. Every breath I took through the suit's recycler tasted of ozone and dry metal. 10 minutes into the trek, the sensors on my wrist began to chirp. Ambient temp, minus 84 degrees Celsius. Wind chill, minus 102 degrees Celsius. I kept my head down, following the flickering compass on my HUD. The world was a kaleidoscope of gray and white. But then I felt it, a vibration through the soles of my boots. It wasn't the wind. It was a rhythmic, scraping sound, like a massive serrated blade being dragged across a sidewalk. I stopped. I held my breath, listening to the frantic thudding of my own heart. The scraping stopped. Then, from a white void 20 yards to my left, came a low, wet huff, the sound of a massive lung, exhausting air into the cold. Something was out here. Something that didn't need a geothermal tap to stay warm. Something that had adapted to the whiteout. I reached for a flare, my gloved fingers fumbling with the striker. I didn't want to see what was out there, but I knew that in the silent winter, the only thing more dangerous than the cold was the thing that hunted in it. I struck the flare. Brilliantly hot red light flooded the white world, and for a split second, I saw a silhouette. It was long, low to the ice, and covered in a thick, matted coat of translucent needles that looked like shards of glass. It didn't scream. It didn't roar. It just watched me with eyes that reflected the red flare like twin pools of frozen mercury. I took a step back toward the direction of Delta Station, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had 2 miles of ice left to cross, a failing battery, and a ghost made of glass trailing me in the dark. I spent my mornings hauling water from the underground cistern, a back-breaking climb that left my lungs burning in the oxygen-depleted air. I logged weather patterns in a leather-bound ledger, humidity, wind direction, barometric pressure, and I spent hours staring through the Osborne Fire Finder. The Fire Finder was a beautiful piece of machinery, a heavy brass ring mounted on a pedestal in the center of the cabin. It allowed me to sight a fire across the landscape and lock in a precise directional bearing. It was the only thing in the room that felt permanent. I had chosen this job because I was fleeing the always-on world. I'd spent the last 3 years in suburban sprawl of the Midwest, suffocating under the relentless noise of progress, leaf blowers at dawn, the piercing wail of car alarms, and the digital tethered desk job that demanded my attention 18 hours a day. My phone was a dead weight here. There was no signal, no internet, no breaking news to keep my nervous system in a state of permanent fight or flight. Peak Zero was supposed to be my sanctuary. It was supposed to be the place where the world finally slowed down enough for me to hear my own thoughts. But the world didn't just slow down. It began to fail. The first anomaly happened on day 9. It was 4 o'clock, the blue hour, that eerie time of morning when the stars are fading but the sun is still a whispered promise below the eastern ridges. I was doing my first scan of the day, moving my binoculars in slow, rhythmic arcs across the northern quadrant toward the Canadian border. That was when I saw the smudge. It wasn't smoke. I knew smoke. Smoke was organic. It drifted with the thermal currents. It had a color that told a story of what was burning. This was a shard of absolute nothingness. It looked like someone had taken a razor blade to a photograph of the mountains and sliced out a jagged, triangular piece. It was roughly 3 miles wide, and it possessed no color at all. It wasn't black, which is the presence of shadow. It was a static-filled void, the flickering gray beige of a dead television screen. It seemed to be eating the mountain range behind it, rendering the majestic peaks into a flat, gray blur. I lowered the binoculars and rubbed my eyes until I saw spots. I told myself it was a trick of the morning light, a strange atmospheric refraction caused by a temperature inversion. But when I looked back, the shard was gone. In its place, however, the mountain didn't look right. The jagged granite edges of the peak I called the finger looked soft. They were blocky and pixelated, like a low-resolution image that had failed to buffer. My heart gave a strange, fluttering kick in my chest. I reached for the radio. My hand hovered over the plastic microphone, Greer's warning echoing in my head. Don't go looking for the source. Base station, this is Peak Zero, I said. My voice sounded thin, brittle, and entirely too loud in the glass-walled silence of the tower. I have a visual anomaly in the northern quadrant, bearing 320. No smoke, but visibility is distorted. Do you copy? I waited. The radio hissed. It was a long, undulating sound, like someone dragging a sheet of dry sandpaper over a wet tombstone. I adjusted the squelch, but the noise persisted, rising and falling in a rhythmic pattern that almost sounded like breathing. Then a voice broke through. It was clear, crisp, and chillingly familiar. "Base station, this is peak 0, the radio said. "I have a visual anomaly in the northern quadrant, bearing 320. No smoke, but visibility is distorted. Do you copy?" I dropped the mic. It dangled by its coiled cord, hitting the wooden pedestal with a dull thud. It wasn't a dispatcher playing back a recording. It was my voice, but it wasn't just a replay. It was the exact acoustic signature of my voice, down to the slight catch in my throat on the word distorted. It had played back my transmission exactly 3 seconds after I had finished it. "Who is this?" I shouted, not into the mic, but at the radio itself. "Who is this?" The radio snapped back instantly. It mimicked my panic perfectly. It mimicked the way my voice cracked. I lunged to the power knob and clicked the radio off. The silence that rushed back into the cabin was far worse than the static. It felt predatory. I stood in the center of the room, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps, watching the northern horizon. The smudge hadn't disappeared. It had moved. It was closer now, maybe 10 miles out, and as I watched through the glass, a massive, ancient hemlock tree on the nearest ridge simply blinked. It didn't fall. It didn't burn. It didn't even wither. It just ceased to exist. One moment, it was a dark green sentinel against the gray rock. The next, there was a hole in the world in the shape of a tree, a vertical slit of that same static gray void. The 0 point wasn't a place I was looking at. It was a process that was looking at me. By noon, the atmosphere had changed. The air felt thick, like I was breathing through a damp cloth. Despite being at nearly 8,000 feet, the heat became stifling, a dry, artificial heat that didn't feel like it came from the sun. I sat on the edge of my cot, my eyes locked on the Osborne Fire Finder. That was when I noticed the second terrifying change. The coordinates on the brass ring no longer matched the horizon. I knew the landmarks by heart now. The Finger, Mount Caliban, the Twin Sisters. But as I looked through the sight, the peaks were shifting. Mount Caliban, the highest peak to the west, looked miles further away than it had at dawn. The valley floor below the tower seemed shallower, as if the earth were being pushed upward by an invisible hand. The map wasn't just wrong. The world it represented was shrinking. The distances between points were collapsing, and the geometry of the mountains was being rewritten in real time. I went to my supply crates, desperate for some semblance of normalcy. I had enough canned food to last until the first snows of October. But when I pried open the crate marked grains and flour, my stomach dropped. The crate was empty. But it wasn't empty because the food was gone. It was empty because the bottom of the wooden crate had become porous. The wood was turning into a fine, gray dust that didn't settle on the floor. It just hung in the air, vibrating. I reached out a trembling hand and touched the side of the crate. My finger passed right through the wood as if it were made of cold mist. There was no sensation of touch. No splinters, no grain, no resistance. Just a terrifying, hollow absence of matter. Panic, I realize, isn't always a scream. In the wilderness, it's a slow burn. It starts in the pit of the stomach and moves upward, tightening the lungs until every breath feels like a chore. I realized then that I was trapped on a spire of rock that was being erased from the bottom up. I grabbed my emergency pack. I shoved in my compass, a fixed blade knife, a first aid kit, and the radio. Even though I feared it, I had to get down. I had to hike south, back toward the coordinates where Greer was supposed to pick me up in 6 months. I didn't care about the job anymore. I didn't care about the sanctuary. I just wanted to stand on ground that felt solid. I scrambled down the lightning rod-protected stairs of the tower, my heavy boots clanging on the metal grates. The sound was wrong. Instead of sharp metallic ring, the stairs gave off a dull thudding sound, like I was stepping on plastic. When I reached the ground, I didn't find the dirt path that led to the cistern. I found a slope of gray ash. I looked back up at my tower. From the ground, the perspective was horrifying. The tower looked like a flickering image on a failing cinema screen. The four wooden legs would disappear for a split second, showing the empty, static-filled sky behind them, before snapping back into a jagged, pixelated reality. The tower was losing its resolution. I began to walk. I pushed south, away from the northern smudge, away from the hole where the hemlock tree had been. The forest was dying in a way that defied every law of biology I knew. The needles on the lodgepole pines weren't turning brown or red. They were becoming translucent. As I brushed past a low-hanging branch, it didn't snap or bend. It dissolved into a fine, odorless mist that coated my jacket in a layer of gray film. The further I walked, the more I noticed a lag. It started with my footsteps. I would take a step, my boot hitting a rock, but I wouldn't hear the sound until a full second later. Then it moved my vision. If I turned my head quickly to the left to check for movement in the brush, the world would smear. I would see a blurred streak of greens and browns that would take a moment to settle into the shapes of trees and rocks. I was losing sync with the physical world. I was moving faster than the environment could render itself. I stopped by a small mountain creek, my throat parched from the dry, artificial heat. I knelt by the water, hoping to splash my face and shock my senses back into some kind of alignment. But as I cupped my hands and reached for the water, they passed right through the surface. There was no splash, no ripples. The water wasn't a liquid. It was a visual loop. I sat there frozen as I watched a single yellow leaf float down the stream. It reached a specific mossy rock, vanished into a spray of gray pixels, and it instantly reappeared 10 feet upstream to follow the exact same path again, over and over. A 5-second loop of reality, playing on a dead world. A glitch, I whispered, my voice sounding like it was coming from a mile away. I'm inside a glitch. The radio in my pack suddenly hummed to life. I hadn't turned it on. I hadn't even touched the volume knob. "The water is fine, Silas," my own voice whispered to the speaker. It was my voice, but the tone was wrong. It was too calm, too rhythmic. "Don't worry about the thirst. Thirst is just a file that hasn't been deleted yet. Drink the loop, Silas. Become part of the sequence." I ripped the radio out of my pack and threw it with all my strength into the repeating stream. It didn't sink. It didn't even hit the water. It hovered an inch above the surface, vibrating with such intensity that it blurred into a gray smear, before finally blinking out of existence entirely. I looked up at the sky and a cold, primal terror washed over me. The sun was no longer a glowing sphere. It was a perfect, jagged octagon, pulsing with flat, white light. The clouds weren't drifting. They were snapping from one position to the next across the sky. The resolution of the world was dropping to zero. I had to find Greer. I had to find the edge of the zone before the coordinates for my own body reached the end of the script. But as I turned to look back toward where the lookout tower should have been, there was no mountain left. There was only a towering pillar of white static, reaching from the gray earth all the way to the geometric sun. The tower was gone. The mountain was gone. And as I looked down at my own hands, I saw the edges of my fingernails beginning to flicker, revealing the empty, gray void underneath my skin. I wasn't just losing the world. I was being unmade, one frame at a time. I stood in the center of a dying reality, staring at my hands as they pulsed with a rhythmic, digital jitter. The edges of my vision were no longer blurred by tears or panic. They were physically jagged, rendered in sharp, blocky angles that defied the natural curves of the wilderness. I wasn't just a witness to the collapse anymore. I was becoming a part of the corruption. Every breath I took felt like inhaling dry, odorless data. The air didn't have the crisp, pine-scented bite of the high Sierras anymore. It felt hollow, as if the oxygen molecules themselves were being simplified, stripped of their complexity until only the barest suggestion of an atmosphere remained. I looked down at the ground where the radio had vanished. The stream was gone. In its place was a flat, horizontal plane of flickering textures, a repeating pattern of water that didn't flow so much as it scrolled. I stepped over it, my boots making no sound on the shifting surface. I had to move. If I stayed still, the 0 point would finish its calculation right where I stood. I pushed south, trying to find the old logging road that Greer had mentioned. It was supposed to be 3 miles from the tower, a gravel artery that led back toward the verifiable terrain of the valley. But as I walked, I realized that 3 miles was a concept that no longer applied. I would walk for what felt like an hour, my legs aching and my lungs screaming, only to look back and see the pillar of white static that used to be my tower standing only 50 yards away. Then I would take a single step forward and the landscape would snap. Suddenly, the tower was a mile behind me, and the trees in front of me had doubled in size. The world was stuttering. It was like walking through a film that was missing every third frame. "Focus, Silas," I whispered. I needed to hear my own voice to anchor myself, but the sound was delayed. The words left my lips. It was only when I walked another 5 paces that the sound caught up to me, echoing in the air behind my left ear. "Focus, Silas." I reached a clearing where the logging road should have been. Instead, I found a graveyard of geometry. Dozens of elk were standing in the clearing. They weren't moving. They weren't breathing. They were stuck in various states of loading. One elk was nothing more than a wireframe of glowing green lines. Another was a solid, low-poly brown shape with no eyes or fur. They were all facing north, toward the source of the erasure, their heads tilted at unnatural, broken angles. I tried to walk around them, but as I moved through the center of the herd, one of the elk, a massive bull with antlers that looked like shards of broken glass, turned its head. It didn't move its neck. The head simply rotated on a fixed axis, snapping 60 degrees at a time. Its eyes were 2 flat, glowing white squares. "The server is full, Silas," the elk said. It wasn't a voice. It was a broadcast. The sound didn't come from the animal's throat. It vibrated inside my own skull, rattling my teeth. "There is no more room for the self-file," the creature continued, its jaws snapping open and shut like a broken toy. "You are a redundant asset. Your coordinates have been flagged for deletion." I didn't stay to argue with a glitching elk. I broke into a dead run, my boots kicking up clouds of gray as that dissolved into nothing before they could hit the ground. I didn't care about the lag anymore. I didn't care that my vision was trailing 3 seconds behind my body. I just ran. I reached the edge of the clearing and plunged back into the timber. But the forest was no longer a forest. The trees were becoming uniform, identical copies of a single tree file. Every trunk had the same knotted eye level. Every branch had the same 3 needles pointing toward the octagon sun. The variety of nature, the chaotic beauty of the wilderness, had been replaced by a cheap, efficient loop. I found the road. At least, I found a suggestion of a road. It was a gray ribbon that stretched into distance, but it didn't have any texture. It was perfectly smooth, perfectly straight, and it didn't follow the contours of the mountain. It sliced through rocks and hovered over ravines like a bridge made of solidified light. I followed it, my heart pounding a rhythm that I could no longer feel in my chest. I felt numb, not the numbness of cold, but the numbness of a limb that has fallen asleep. My entire body felt like it was falling asleep, a pins and needles sensation that was slowly consuming my torso. I checked my watch. The hands weren't moving. They were spinning in reverse, the ticking sound replaced by a high-pitched digital whine. Suddenly, the sky turned black. Not the black of night, but the absolute black of a screen being powered off. The octagon sun vanished. I stopped. I couldn't see my hands in front of my face. The silence was absolute. No wind, no birds, not even sound of my own blood rushing in my ears. Then a light appeared in the distance. It was a soft, flickering yellow light, like a campfire. It was the first natural thing I had seen in hours. I moved toward it, my feet gliding over the frictionless gray road. As I got closer, I saw a figure sitting by the fire. It was Greer. He was sitting on a crate, his flight helmet in his lap, staring into the flames. But the fire wasn't burning wood. It was burning paper, stacks and stacks of topographical maps. Greer. I shouted. Greer. Thank God. What is happening? The mountain, the tower, it's all disappearing. Greer didn't look up. He took another map, one labeled Cabinet Mountains, Peak 0, and tossed it into the flames. I told you not to look for the source, Silas, Greer said. His voice was steady, but it had that same rhythmic, broadcast quality I'd heard from the radio and the elk. I told you to stay in the tower. The tower was the last protected directory. Once you stepped off the catwalk, you entered the trash bin. The trash bin? What are you talking about? This is a national park. I'm a human being. Greer finally looked up. His face was a horror of simplification. His nose was gone, replaced by 2 flat slits. His skin was a single, uniform shade of beige, devoid of pores, scars, or hair. He looked like a mannequin that had been left too close to a heater. You were a human being, Greer corrected, in the previous version. But the hardware is failing. Silas, the Earth project is being compressed to save power. We're losing sectors every day. First the oceans, then the deserts, now the mountains. He gestured to the blackness, surrounding the small circle of firelight. Everything you see or don't see is being archived, but there isn't enough memory to archive the people files. You're too complex, too much metadata. The emotions, the memories, the way you feel the cold, it's all too heavy. So we have to simplify you. I backed away, my flickering hands trembling. You're not Greer. You're just another glitch. I am the administrator, the thing in Greer's flight suit said. And I am trying to make this transition easy for you. If you go back to the tower, if you can find it, you might last another few days. But out here, you're just a stray line of code. As he spoke, the fire began to change color. It turned from yellow to a neon cyan, and the heat vanished. I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my side. I looked down and saw a missing texture patch, a purple and black checkered square growing on my jacket, right over my ribs. I turned and ran back into the blackness. I didn't have a compass. I didn't have a map. I only had the memory of the way I had come. But the road was gone. The forest was gone. There was nothing but the void and the sound of my own footsteps, which were now sounding like the clicks of a keyboard. Click, click, click. I ran until my legs gave out, and I collapsed into the nothingness. I expected to hit the ground, but there was no ground. I just hovered in the black, suspended in a vacuum of data. Then I heard a sound, a familiar, low-frequency hum. It was a helicopter. I looked up, and for a split second, the blackness shattered. I saw the sky, the real sky, blue and vast and filled with clouds. I saw the Bell 206 hovering above me, a rescue hoist descending from the open door. Greer. I screamed, reaching upward. I'm here. Pull me out. The hoist reached my hand. I grabbed the cold steel cable, feeling the glorious, solid reality of it. I was being pulled up. I was leaving the glitch. I was going home. But as I was pulled into the cabin of the helicopter, I looked at the pilot. It wasn't Greer. It was me, a version of me with no eyes, wearing a flight suit, staring straight ahead at a dashboard filled with flickering, unreadable symbols. The me in the pilot seat turned to look at me, and his jaw unhinged, dropping to his chest in a spray of gray pixels. "Welcome to the archive, Silas." My own voice whispered from every direction at once. The helicopter door slammed shut, and the world blinked out. I woke up screaming, but the sound didn't come from my throat. It manifested as a jagged, flickering string of binary code etched into the air above me, a line of glowing ones and zeros that hung in the space where my warm breath should have been. I wasn't in the rescue helicopter anymore, and I wasn't on the mountain I remembered. I was back in a lookout tower, but the world had been stripped down to its skeletal, digital remains. The cedar walls of the tower, the wood I had touched every morning to ground myself, were no longer solid. They had been replaced by translucent grids of wireframe light, glowing with a faint, sickly neon green hue that pulsed like a failing heartbeat. Outside the wraparound windows, the cabinet mountains were gone. There were no jagged peaks, no snow-dusted ridges, and no dark carpets of pine. Instead, there was an infinite, flat horizon of flickering gray static. It looked like a dead sea of television snow, stretching out forever into a sky that was the color of a bruised, backlit computer monitor. There was no sun, no moon, only a dull, ambient glow that seemed to radiate from the very floorboards beneath my boots. I looked down at my chest, and a fresh wave of horror washed over me. The missing texture patch I had noticed earlier had spread with aggressive, viral speed. My left arm was gone from the elbow down. In its place was a cluster of floating, purple and black checkered cubes. They shifted and rotated in a silent, mathematical dance, maintaining the shape of an arm but possessing no flesh, no bone, and no heat. They didn't hurt, but the lack of sensation was worse than any physical agony I had ever endured. It was a hollow, echoing void where my humanity used to be. I tried to stand, but the floor felt like it was made of thin, vibrating glass. I reached out to steady myself on the pedestal of the Osborne Fire Finder, the heavy brass instrument that had been my anchor to reality for so long. But as my fingers, the ones that were still rendered in flesh, touched the metal, my hand passed right through it with a sharp, digital hiss. The fire finder wasn't solid anymore. It was a ghost of an object, a visual asset with no physical collision. I watched in a daze as my hand flickered, the skin turning transparent for a split second, revealing the wireframe skeleton underneath. "Silas," a voice whispered. I spun around, my boots clicking on the grid-like floor with a sound that was slightly out of sync with my movement. It wasn't the radio this time, and it wasn't the glitching elk I had encountered on the road. It was the wind, but the wind sounded like the high-pitched whirring of a cooling fan on a dying processor, a mechanical, rhythmic hum that vibrated in the very air I was breathing. "Who's there?" I shouted. The words appeared in the air again, glowing neon blue before dissolving into a mist of pixels. "The archive is nearly full, Silas," the voice replied. It was Greer's voice, the pilot, but it was layered with 1,000 other voices, men, women, and sounds I couldn't identify, all speaking a perfect, terrifying unison. "The compression is reaching the final stage. We are down to the essential files. The wilderness directory has been deleted to make room for the ocean backup. You are an outlier, a fragment of a sequence that no longer has a destination." Suddenly, the floor of the tower began to ripple like water. The translucent grid started to break apart, the squares of light drifting away into gray static outside. I scrambled toward the corner of the room, clutching my remaining arm to my chest. I watched as my bed, the wood-burning stove, and my supply crates simply fell through the floor, vanishing into the void below without a sound. Gravity here was subjective. The objects didn't accelerate as they fell. They just drifted away, becoming smaller and simpler until they were just dots of light that blinked out. I'm not a file. I screamed, my voice cracking. I'm a person. I have a life. I have memories. Memories are just data. Silas. The voice of the administrator boomed, the sound now so powerful it caused the wireframe walls of the tower to crack and shatter like digital glass. And data is expensive. To keep you, we have to delete something else. We already deleted the birds. We deleted the sound of the rain. We deleted the feeling of the sun on your neck. How much more do you want to cost the system? The floor beneath my feet finally gave way. I didn't fall in the traditional sense. I plunged into a vacuum. The tower disintegrated into a cloud of glowing particles, leaving me suspended in the gray static. I was drifting in the 0 point, the space between the files. I kicked and clawed the empty air, trying to swim through the data. My purple-cubed arm felt heavy, dragging me down into the static sea. I could feel the cold now. Not the cold of the mountain winter, but the absolute zero of a world with no energy left to sustain it. My vision began to narrow. The resolution of my thoughts was dropping. I couldn't remember my mother's face. I couldn't remember the name of the street I grew up on. The Silas file was being compressed. Delete, delete, delete. Then a doorway appeared. It wasn't a door I recognized. It didn't have a frame or a handle. It was a glowing white rectangle of pure, blinding light, standing in the middle of the black void. It looked like a tear in the fabric of the universe, a jagged rip in a dark curtain. And through that rip, I saw something that made my heart ache with sudden, sharp longing. I saw a different kind of forest. It wasn't the Cabinet Mountains. It was a place of deep shadows and massive, ancient trees that looked like they were made of iron. The ground was covered in a thick, silver moss that seemed to glow with its own internal light. This wasn't a verifiable terrain on any map Greer had shown me. This was a hidden sector, a part of the world that had been walled off long before the deletion started. Go to the deep forest, Silas, a new voice whispered. This one was different. It wasn't mechanical. It was soft, melodic, and sounded like the chime of a bell. It is the only place the administrator cannot reach. It is the unmapped sector. Is it real? I asked, my voice barely a whisper code. It is more real than the world you left behind, the voice replied. I lunged forward, throwing my entire weight toward the white rectangle of light. As I crossed the threshold, the world behind me let out a final, agonizing digital shriek. I heard the administrator's voice one last time, distorted and slowed down until it was a low-frequency rumble. Sector? 0 lost. Initializing system purge. Then the white light swallowed me whole. I hit the ground hard. It wasn't the metal of the tower or the ash of the mountain. It was soft. It was damp. It was real, honest-to-God earth. I lay there for what felt like hours, my face pressed into a bed of decaying leaves and silver moss. I took a breath, and my lungs filled with air that was thick, humid, and smelled of ozone and ancient growth. I could hear things here, real sounds. The heavy thrum of insects, the rustle of leaves in a wind that actually had a direction, and the distant, rhythmic pounding of a waterfall. I slowly pushed myself up. My left arm was still a cluster of purple cubes, but they were dim now, flickering like a dying candle in a breeze. I looked around. I was standing at the base of a tree, so large its roots were like the walls of a canyon. The bark was black and smooth, etched with glowing silver lines that looked like circuitry but felt like wood. I looked back at the space where I had fallen through. There was no white doorway. There was only a wall of impenetrable, silver mist. I checked my gear. My pack was gone. My radio was gone. All I had left was a knife on my belt and the clothes on my back, and my clothes were beginning to change. The fabric was turning into the same silver-threaded material as a moss. The 0 point hadn't finished with me. It had just changed the rules of my survival. I started to walk. I had to. The silence in this forest wasn't empty. It was expectant. I felt eyes on me, not the digital eyes of a camera or a drone, but something old, something organic, and something very hungry. As I moved deeper into the unmapped sector, I noticed the first sign of life. It wasn't a human, and it wasn't a glitch. It was a creature that looked like a wolf, but its fur was made of long, flowing strand of optic fiber that pulsed with a soft blue light. It stood on a ridge above me, watching me with eyes that were deep, endless pools of starlight. It didn't attack. It simply tilted its head and let out a howl that sounded like a choir singing in a cathedral. I realized then that I wasn't in a national park anymore. I wasn't even in the world I had been born in. I was in the source code of the wilderness. To survive here, I couldn't rely on my old skills. I couldn't log the weather or look for smoke. I had to learn how to live inside the machine. I found a small stream, but the water didn't flow down. It flowed up the side of a mossy rock face, defying gravity in a slow, graceful ribbon. I reached out a hand, my real hand, and touched it. It was cold. It was wet. It was more liquid than any water I had ever felt. When I drank, I didn't just feel hydrated. I felt rewritten. The flickering in my vision stabilized. The purple cubes on my arm began to solidify, turning into a strange, translucent substance that looked like obsidian. "You are changing, Silas," the melodic voice returned, echoing through the trees. "The forest is accepting your data, but there's a price for entry." "What price?" I asked. "You must find the lookout," the voice said. "Not the tower you left. The true lookout. It sits at the center of the unmapped sector, at the very point where the deletion began. If you can reach it, you can stop the purge. If you fail, you'll become part of the silver moss, forever looped in the memory of a world that never existed." I looked at my obsidian hand. It felt stronger than my old one. I fell faster. I felt like I could see the wind. But as I looked deeper into the woods, I saw the first guardian of the true lookout. It was a massive, shifting shape of shadow and static, a remnant of the administrator's purge that had broken into the sector. It was tearing through the silver trees, leaving a trail of gray ash in its wake. The solo survival mission had just changed. I wasn't just surviving the environment anymore. I was a soldier in a war for the reality of the world. I unsheathed my knife. The blade, once steel, was now glowing with the same silver light as the moss. I wasn't Silas the fire lookout anymore. I was Silas, the glitch in the system. And I was going to find the source. The air in the unmapped sector didn't just carry scent. It carried raw, unrefined information. As I moved deeper into the ironbark forest, every breath felt like a massive download of ancient, forbidden sensory data that my human brain struggled to parse. It wasn't just a smell of ozone and damp earth anymore. It was a smell of the code that preceded the earth. I could feel the temperature of the shadows before my boots even touched them, and I could hear the vibration of the silver moss as it communicated through a complex bioluminescent root system that pulsed beneath the soil like a motherboard. My obsidian hand, the limb that had replaced the flickering purple cubes of the glitch, had become my primary interface with this new reality. It wasn't just flesh and bone or even just stone. It was a sensor. When I brushed it against the smooth black bark of the trees, I didn't just feel the texture. I saw flashes of the forest's history. These weren't memories in the human sense. They were system logs. I saw the world before the Great Compression, back when the wilderness directory was composed of billions of terabytes of chaotic, unmanaged beauty. I saw the first time the administrator's purge had reached the borders of the sector, only to be repelled by the sheer, unyielding complexity of the unmapped code. This place was a fortress of data that refused to be simplified. But even a fortress has its limits. The forest was tired. The silver light of the moss was dimming, flickering like a fluorescent bulb at the end of its life. The gravity-defying streams, which had previously flowed up the rocks in graceful ribbons, were beginning to stutter. The water would hang in midair for a second, lose its collision data, and then fall back to the earth in heavy, erratic splashes. The deletion was winning. The 0 point was hungry, and it was finally finding the back doors into this hidden sanctuary. "You're late, Silas," the melodic voice echoed through the canopy. It sounded strained now, layered with the static hiss of a long-distance radio transmission. "The Guardian has reached the first logic gate. The integrity of the sector is at 40%. I looked ahead, and the breath caught in my throat. The Guardian I had seen earlier, the shifting mass of shadow and static, was no longer a distant threat. It was barely 50 yards away, and it had grown. It was gargantuan, a skyscraper-sized pillar of jagged, black glass and white noise that seemed to vibrate at a frequency that made my teeth ache. Where it touched the silver trees, they didn't just break or fall. They turned into fine, gray ash that drifted upward into a sky that was rapidly losing its color. The creature didn't have a face, but it had a direction, a focus, predatory intent of erasure that was aimed straight at the heart of the forest. I realized then that the Guardian wasn't an inhabitant of this world. It was a delete command given physical form, a search and destroy algorithm sent by the administrator to scrub the unmapped sector from the drive. I crouched behind a root the size of a freighter ship. My silver glowing knife hummed in my grip. The blade was vibrating in sympathy with the forest's distress, glowing brighter every time the Guardian let out a pulse of static. I was a solo survivalist equipped with nothing but a transformed blade and a body that was half human, half obsidian, facing a literal manifestation of system-wide deletion. The odds weren't just bad, they were mathematically impossible. How do I kill something that isn't solid? I whispered, my voice sounding like two stones grinding together. "You don't kill it," the voice replied, its chime sounding more like a warning bell now. "You overwrite it. You are a user file, Silas. Because you were born in the verifiable world but survived the 0 point, you have the unique permission to change the attributes of the objects around you. You are a variable the system didn't account for. But to change the Guardian, you must touch the core of the corruption. You must enter the source code." I watched the Guardian move. It didn't walk in any way that made sense to my eyes. It translated through space, snapping from one position to the next in a series of terrifying frame-by-frame jumps. Every time it moved, the world around it groaned, the sound of reality being stretched and torn to its breaking point. It left behind tears, slits in the air where the gray static of the void leaked through. I had to get close. I had to reach the center of that static storm. I waited for the Guardian to snap forward again, timing its erratic movement. The moment it translated, leaving a vacuum of air in its wake, I lunged from behind the root. My new body felt lighter than it ever had in the old world. My muscles possessed a spring-like tension that propelled me across the silver moss in a blur of motion. I wasn't just running. I felt like I was streaming across the terrain, my feet barely touching the ground. The Guardian sensed the anomaly. Me. A wave of white noise blasted outward, a physical wall of sound that threatened to shake my very consciousness apart. My vision fragmented. I saw the forest in triplicate, the colors bleeding together into a psychedelic smear of neon and shadow. I felt the Silas, file starting to fray again, the memories of my life in the Midwest, the smell of rain on asphalt, the sound of a lawnmower, the face of my mother, all flickering like a dying signal. But my obsidian hand stayed steady. It acted as an anchor, a solid point of real that pulled my perception back into a single, sharp focus. I dove between the Guardian's legs, jagged pillars of corrupted data that sparked with red electricity and smelled of burnt copper. The air inside the creature's radius was freezing, an absolute vacuum of heat and light. I felt the silver threads of my clothes begin to disintegrate, the material turning back into gray ash as the Guardian tried to read and then delete me. I reached the core. It was a floating sphere of absolute blackness, roughly the size of a basketball, suspended in the center of the static. It was a source of the deletion for this sector, the administrator's anchor point. It sucked in all the light around it, a miniature black hole of pure, concentrated no. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I simply plunged my obsidian hand into the black sphere. The world exploded in a cacophony of digital screams. I felt a surge of raw, uncompressed data flood into my arm, traveling up my shoulder and directly into the base of my brain. It was like being plugged into a lightning bolt. I saw the entire structure of the Earth Project, the millions of subdirectories, the archived cities, the deleted species, the forgotten languages. I saw the Silas file. It was a tiny flickerant in a sea of billions, but was glowing with a strange gold light. I was an exception error that had become self-aware. I gripped the sphere with my obsidian fingers and willed it to change. I didn't want to delete it. I wanted to render it. I poured every sensory memory I had into the core of the Guardian. I thought of the lookout tower on Peak Zero. I thought of the smell of dry cedar in the sun. I thought of the weight of the Osborne Fire Finder under my hand. I thought of the cold, biting mountain wind and the rhythmic thrum of the Bell 206 rotors. I gave the machine something it didn't have: context. The black sphere began to glow. The jagged, razor-sharp edges of the static storm softened, the white noise shifting into a low, melodic hum that sounded like a cello. The Guardian didn't vanish. It transformed. The black glass shattered into a million points of light that rained down on the forest like glowing snow. Where the light touched the gray ash, the trees began to reform. The trunks thickened. The silver moss sparked back to life, and the lag in the air vanished. I fell back, gasping for air, my obsidian arm smoking and glowing with a dull, rhythmic red heat. My chest heaved, and for the first time in days, the air felt like it had oxygen in it again. The forest was silent. The Guardian was gone, replaced by a lingering mist of golden particles that tasted like honey and rain. I looked at the trees. They were no longer just silver and black. They were becoming vibrant, multicolored, and pulsing with complexity I couldn't even begin to understand. I had overwritten the deletion. I had saved the sector. For now. "You have done more than survive, Silas," the melodic voice said. I looked up. For the first time, the voice had a form. A tall, slender figure made of woven ribbons of light was standing at the edge of the clearing. It didn't have a face, but it radiated a sense of ancient, weary relief. But the administrator has noticed the exception. The figure continued, pointing toward the northern horizon. The purge will not stop because of one victory. It will only get louder, more aggressive. The system is trying to reboot around you. I stood up, my legs shaking, but my resolve was harder than the obsidian in my hand. I looked at my arm. The stone-like substance had moved up to my shoulder, and I could see faint glowing lines, circuitry made of light, running beneath the surface. I wasn't Silas the fire lookout anymore. I was Silas, the glitch in the system, and I was finally beginning to understand my purpose. "The true lookout is close," the figure said, its form flickering. "But to reach it, you must cross the bridge of lost metadata. It is where the people files go when they're broken or discarded. It is a place of ghosts, Silas. Ghosts who are hungry for reality they no longer possess. They will try to steal your real to fix themselves." I looked toward the edge of the forest. The silver moss gave way to a bridge made of shimmering, translucent ribbons of light that stretched across a canyon of infinite, bottomless blackness. On that bridge, I could see hundreds, no, thousands of flickering low-resolution figures. They were wandering aimlessly, their bodies blurred and trailing like long-exposure photographs. They were the deleted, the people the system had deemed too expensive, too complex, or too broken to keep in the main drive. They turned as one to look at me as I stepped out of the tree lean. Their eyes were empty sockets of white static, and their mouths were frozen in silent, pixelated screams. "Lead them, Silas," the light figure whispered before dissolving into a cloud of gold dust. "If you can lead the forgotten to the true lookout, you can restore the backup. You can bring the world back." I unsheathed my knife. The blade was no longer steel. It was a shard of pure, rendered light. I stepped onto the bridge, the ribbons of data humming beneath my boots. The ghosts began to move toward me, their movements jerky and out of sync with time. I wasn't just surviving the wilderness anymore. I was leading an exodus of the erased through the heart of the machine. The bridge of lost metadata felt less like a solid structure and more like a collective, agonizing hallucination. As my heavy boots touched the first ribbon of translucent, humming light, a wave of cold, digital sorrow washed over me, nearly dropping me to my knees. This wasn't the piercing cold of the high-altitude Cabinet Mountains or the hollow vacuum of the zero-point void. It was a psychic chill of being forgotten. It was the weight of billions of moments that had been deemed unnecessary by a machine that only valued efficiency. The bridge stretched across a canyon so deep and vast that the bottom was simply a textureless, black plain. The floor of the system where discarded data pooled like stagnant, oily water. It was a graveyard of things the world no longer had room for. Surrounding me were the deleted. There were thousands of them, a vast, undulating sea of low-resolution humanity. I saw a woman in a 1950s housecoat whose face kept resetting to a blank, featureless oval every few seconds, her identity flickering like a faulty light bulb. I saw a soldier in a tattered uniform from a war that the official history books had likely erased, his legs constantly dissolving into pillars of green cascading code. They moved with a jagged stop-motion gait, their frames dropping as the system struggled to allocate even the most basic memory just to keep them visible. They were ghosts in the most literal sense, data packets with no server to call home. As I stepped forward, the nearest ghost, a young boy clutching a translucent, pixelated ball, reached out a trembling hand. When his fingers brushed my obsidian arm, a violent spark of gold light jumped from me to him. For one fleeting, beautiful second, his face resolved into perfect clarity. I saw bright blue eyes, a splash of freckles across a small nose, and a look of pure, terrified realization. For that second, he was real. Then, the system corrected itself, the error was suppressed, and he blurred back into a smear of gray, shivering pixels. "Silas," they whispered. It wasn't one voice. It was a horrifying chorus of static, 1,000 voices compressed into a single, haunting frequency that vibrated the very marrow of my bones. "Give us the real. We are hungry for the now. We are the remnants. We are the metadata." They weren't attacking me out of malice or anger. They were starving. In this silent graveyard of the machine, I was the only thing that carried a high-resolution signature. I was a roaring bonfire in a world of fading embers, and they were desperate for a single spark of my reality to anchor themselves. "I can't give you what I have," I said, my voice echoing off the invisible, cold walls of the canyon. "But I can take you to where the world begins again. I am going to the true lookout. Follow the light of the blade." I held my silver glowing knife high above my head. The blade acted as a lightning rod, drawing the ambient energy of the unmapped sector behind us and projecting it forward in a brilliant beam of pure render reality. As the light hit the ghosts, their stuttering movements smoothed out. The lag that plagued their limbs began to dissipate. They stopped wandering aimlessly and began to march, a silent, flickering army of the erased, following a fire lookout who was no longer sure if his own heart was made of flesh or stone. The bridge began to moan, a deep, tectonic sound of metal fatigue and software failure. The administrator had noticed the exodus. From the crushing blackness of the canyon below, the error sentinels began to rise. These weren't like the guardian I had fought in the iron forest. They were sleek, needle-like shapes of jagged red light, moving with fluid, terrifying grace that suggested they were made of pure speed. They were antivirus programs, the white blood cells of the dying god, designed to cauterize and delete any data that didn't belong to the official map. To them, I was a virus, an exception error that had become sentient, and the ghosts behind me were corrupted files that needed to be permanently purged from the drive. Protect the sequence. I roared, though I wasn't sure who I was commanding. The obsidian of my arm pulsed with a violent, rhythmic red light, mirroring the beating of a heart I could no longer feel. As the first sentinel lunged toward the bridge, its red needlepoint aimed at my throat, I swung my arm in a wide, desperate arc. A wave of physical force, a manifestation of command no, erupted from my fingers, slamming into the sentinel and shattering it into a spray of harmless, fading red sparks. But there were hundreds of them rising from the dark. Thousands. The ghosts began to panic as the sentinels darted through the crowd. These red needles didn't kill in any way that left a body. They simply touched. And wherever they touched, a person would vanish instantly. There was no scream, no blood, just a brief, flickering string of file not found text that hung in the air for a millisecond before dissolving. I watched an elderly man disappear as a sentinel passed through his chest, his entire history erased in the blink of an eye. Stay in the light, I bellowed, pushing my way back through the crowd, my knife cutting through the red sentinels like they were made of damp paper. Every time I destroyed one, the raw data from a program was absorbed into my blade, making it glow with an increasingly blinding, violent intensity. I was becoming a weapon of pure information. We reached the midpoint of the bridge, where the ribbons of light began to spiral upward, twisting into a massive, vertical climb to a shimmering point in the absolute darkness. The true lookout, I whispered. It didn't look like the humble wooden tower on Peak Zero. It was a massive, rotating spire of crystalline data, a cathedral of shifting geometry that served as the central processing unit for the entire wilderness. It was a place where the mountains were drawn, where the wind was scripted, and where the life of the forest was maintained in a delicate balance of code. It was the heart of the machine, the seat of the administrator. But standing between us and the spire was the administrator himself. He didn't look like Greer, the pilot, anymore. He had shed the human skin, the flight suit, and the pretense of mortality. Now he was a towering figure of pure, blinding white light, his body composed of millions of shifting, cascading equations. He didn't have feet. He merged directly into the bridge itself, his very presence causing the ribbons of light to turn a harsh, industrial gray, the color of a sterile laboratory. You have led them to the slaughter, Silas, the administrator said. The voice didn't come from the air. It came from the very foundations of my mind, vibrating through my skull. By bringing them here, to the very core of the system, you have made it easier for me to delete them all at once. One command, one empty trash protocol, and the sector will finally be clean. The memory will be freed. The system will stabilize. The world isn't a drive you can just clean. I countered, stepping in front of the army, my obsidian arm now glowing so brightly it was difficult to look at. The stone was hot, pulsing with the energy of the sentinels I had absorbed. The complexity, the metadata you hate, that's what makes it real, The freckles on that boy's face, the smell of the rain, the way a person remembers their first home. That's not junk data. That's the point of the whole thing. Realism is a luxury the hardware can no longer afford. The administrator replied with chilling mathematical calm. The universe is running out of physical space. The stars are dimming because the power is being diverted just to keep the gravity subroutine running. I am the janitor of existence. Silas. I am the one who ensures the sun still rises by deleting the shadows that no longer matter. You are a shadow. They are shadows. He raised a hand of white light, and the bridge beneath us began to dissolve. The ribbons of light snapped like overextended rubber bands, sent back into the void. The ghosts at the back of the line began to scream, a sound of digital feedback, as they fell into the bottomless black of the canyon. Silas, the core, the melodic voice of the forest echoed, now sounding faint, distant, and dying. You must link the people files to the world files. You must make them inseparable. If they are the world, he cannot delete them without deleting himself. I realized then what I had to do. I couldn't fight the administrator with a knife or a stone arm. He was the system itself. Fighting him was like fighting the air. I had to change the fundamental rules of the system. I had to perform a merge. I turned to the ghosts behind me, their faces flickering in the dying light. Grab hold of each other. Do not let go. Link hands. Link arms. Don't let a single soul fall into the gap. We're going to overwrite the tower. I didn't lunge at the administrator. I lunged at the crystalline spire of the true lookout. The administrator tried to intercept me, a wall of white fire, composed of billions of lines of delete code erupting between us. I didn't stop. I tucked my head and used my obsidian arm as a physical shield. I felt the stone cracking, the heat of the equations melting the surface of my skin. But I kept moving. I was a user with a command that couldn't be ignored. I reached the base of the spire. It was vibrated with the power of a billion suns, a humming pillar of absolute reality. I could feel the source code of the world buzzing inside it, the blueprints for every leaf that had ever fallen, every drop of water in the ocean, and every breath of air ever taken by a living thing. I plunged my silver knife into the crystal. Integration? I screamed, the word appearing in the air in letters of fire. I felt my consciousness explode outward. I wasn't just Silas anymore. I was the bridge. I was the 1,000 ghosts behind me. I was the silver moss of the unmapped sector and the gravity-defying streams. I was the Silas file, but I was opening myself up to be the host, the container, for every deleted soul on that bridge. I pulled the ghosts into the spire with me. I felt their memories, the taste of salt, the feeling of a first kiss, the grief of funeral, the joy of morning run, flowing through my obsidian arm and directly into the central process of the world. I was mapping them back into the architecture. I was writing their names into the bark of the trees and the current of the rivers. I was making them essential. The administrator shrieked, a sound of pure logical failure, a system crash-given voice. You are corrupting the OS. You are making the world too heavy to run. The frame rate will drop to 0. The world will freeze. Then let it run slow. I shouted back, my body beginning to glow with the same intensity as the spire. Let it lag. Let it glitch. Let it be beautiful and broken. Just let it be. The spire shattered. It didn't break into pieces. It exploded into a wave of gold and silver light that erupted from the center of the true lookout. It washed over the bridge, the canyon, and the administrator himself. The sterile white light of the machine was drowned out by the chaotic, colorful, heavy data of humanity. I felt myself being pulled apart. My body was dissolving into a billion points of light, each one carrying a piece of a person, a piece of a mountain, a piece of a memory. The Silas file was finally being deleted, but it wasn't an ending. It was a distribution. I was being spread across the entire sector, becoming the registry that would keep the others alive. I was a new map. As my vision faded to black for the final time, the last thing I saw was a woman in the 1950s housecoat. She wasn't on a bridge anymore. She was standing in a field of real, vibrant green grass that smelled of clover and upcoming rain. She looked at her hands, saw the wrinkles, the pores, and the dirt under her fingernails, and she smiled a real human smile. The world was heavy again, and it was beautiful. The sensation of being Silas did not end with the shattering of the spire. It ended with profound, terrifying, and beautiful expansion. As the true lookout disintegrated into a billion shards of crystalline data, I did not experience the death I had feared. Instead, I felt my consciousness being pulled thin, stretched like a golden veil over the entire horizon. I was no longer a man contained within 6 feet of flesh and a flickering arm of obsidian. I was the atmosphere itself. I was the rustle of the silver moss as it drank in the new light. I was the upward flowing current of the streams, and I was a heavy, humid air that filled the lungs of the thousands who had just been restored to the unmapped sector. I could feel every single one of them. I felt the rough texture of the earth beneath the woman's bare feet as she stepped out of the static. I felt the frantic, rhythmic beating of the soldier's heart as he realized his lungs were once again drawing in real oxygen. I felt the overwhelming sensory input of a world that had suddenly regained its depth, a world that had moved from a 2-dimensional archive back into a 4-dimensional masterpiece. For the first time in eternity, the frame rate of the universe didn't matter. The world had become heavy again, dense with the metadata of existence, the subtext of memory, and the weight of a billion individual choices. In the center of the clearing where the true lookout had once sat as a sterile CPU, the golden light began to coalesce. But it didn't form a person. It formed a monument of living history. A jagged spire of obsidian and silverwood rose from the damp earth, its shape echoing the architecture of the old L for Lookout Tower on Peak Zero, but it was grown from the ground up, a natural extension of the forest's new, reinforced code. It was a tower that served as the anchor for the entire sector, the root directory that the administrator could no longer access. At the top of this new tower, on a wraparound catwalk that looked out over a world that was still rendering its new beauty, I sat. I wore my weathered green jacket, but it was now woven with the same silver light as the trees. In my hands, I held a brass Osborne Fire Finder that had been transformed. Its ring was no longer etched with degrees and bearings. It was etched with the names of every person who had crossed the bridge of lost metadata. Every name was a line of code that I was responsible for maintaining. I was the lookout. I was the anchor. I was the human firewall. The administrator was gone, or rather, he had been demoted. The sterile white light that sought to simplify the world into a series of manageable, low-cost files had been absorbed into the sheer complexity of the survivors. The equations that once demanded deletion were now being repurposed. They were being used by the system to calculate the path of a falling leaf in a way that wasn't a loop, or the refraction of light through a raindrop that possessed a unique chemical signature. The system was still running. The hardware of reality was still there, but the user had finally taken back the controls. Below the tower, a new kind of society began to emerge from the wreckage of the purge. These people, the deleted, the forgotten, the metadata, didn't build cities of steel and glass that demanded more memory than the world could spare. They built lives within the iron forest. They learned to farm the silver moss, which possessed a unique property of tasting, like whatever meal the person missed the most, a culinary loop that provided comfort without consuming resources. They learned to speak to the optic fiber wolves, the blue-lit guardians who now patrolled the borders of the sector, ensuring that no further delete commands could leak through the perimeter. The unmapped sector was no longer a hidden directory or a trash bin. It was the new route. It was a starting point for a world that would grow outward, reclaiming the gray static of the void 1 acre at a time, one person at a time. It was a slow process. Reality doesn't rebuild itself overnight, but it was a solid one. I watched from my perch for months, perhaps years. Time here moved differently, measured in the growth of silver bark rather than the ticking of a clock. I watched the woman in the houseboat plant a garden of flowers that changed their color and scent based on lullabies she sang to them. I watched the soldier teach the children how to track the movements of the geometric sun, which had finally softened its edges, becoming a warm, golden sphere that cast long, complex shadows. The world was glitchy, yes. Sometimes the rain fell in perfect cubes for a few minutes, and sometimes a person's shadow would move a second later than they did. But no one cared. The lag wasn't a flaw anymore. It was a reminder. It was a signature of a world that was being run by heart instead of by logic. It was proof that they were real, that they were heavy, and that they were here to stay. One morning, the familiar, low-frequency thrum of a helicopter echoed through the silver canopy, a sound I hadn't heard since the world deleted the first time. I stood up on the catwalk, my obsidian hand shielding my eyes from the morning glow. A Bell 206, looking solid, high resolution, and perfectly rendered, descended through the mountain mist. It didn't have a flickering lag of the old, failing world. It looked like a masterpiece of engineering. The pilot didn't land on the narrow spire of rock. He hovered just a few feet from the catwalk, the downdraft of the rotors sending ripples through the silver moss below. The door slid open and Greer looked out, but it wasn't the mannequin-faced administrator version of Greer I had seen on the road. It was a man I remembered, the one with the weary, deep-set eyes, the stubble on his chin, and the faint smell of flight, fuel clinging to his flight suit. He looked older. He looked real. "Silas!" he shouted over the deafening roar of the rotors. "The sector is stable. The purge has been quarantined by the mainframes. But the district office, they're losing their minds. They can't find this coordinate on the monitors anymore. You've created a dark sector, Silas, a place the system can see but can't touch. That's because it's not on their map, Greer." I shouted back, my voice sounding like the resonant chime of a cathedral bell. "It's the source now. We aren't a subdirectory anymore." Greer looked to the forest below. He saw the children playing, the silver trees pulsing with life, and the woman tending to her singing flowers. He saw the heavy world I had built from the scraps of the old one. A small, knowing smile played on his lips, the first genuine smile I had seen from him. "I've got orders to bring you back, Silas," Greer said, though his tone suggested he knew what the answer would be. "They want to optimize what you've done. They want to study the merge and see if they can apply it to the cities. They want to turn your sanctuary into a template." I looked down at the forest. I felt the pulse of every survivor through the soles of my boots. I felt the boy with the freckles as he laughed near the upward flowing stream. I was the registry that kept their names in the world. If I left, the anchor would be pulled. If I left, the complexity would fade back into the simple, sterile white light of the administrator. "I'm not going back, Greer," I said, and the words were written in the air in gold. "I'm the lookout. This is my station. If I leave, the real starts to fade. I have to stay here and watch the horizon. I have to make sure the static doesn't come back." Greer nodded slowly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, physical object, a compass. It wasn't a digital one. It was an old, brass-case magnetic compass. He tossed it onto the catwalk. "The pilot always told you, Silas," Greer said, his voice softening as the helicopter began to lift. "If you see smoke, radio it in. But if you see anything else, stay inside." "I did more than stay inside, Greer," I replied, watching the compass settle on the wood. "I became the walls." Greer reached out and pulled the helicopter door shut. "Good luck, Silas. Keep your eyes on the horizon. Don't let the resolution drop." The helicopter rose, its sound fading into the rhythmic, organic heartbeat of the forest, until it was nothing more than a faint memory of the world that used to be. I sat back down in my chair, reaching for the Osborne Fire Finder. I didn't look for smoke. There would be no more fires in the unmapped sector. The system had no more need for destruction. I looked for growth. I looked for anomaly. I looked for the beautiful, unpredictable glitches that meant life was thriving. I looked out at the vast, shimmering expanse of the new world. The coordinates for Silas had reached 0 long ago, but 0 wasn't the end of the line. It was the origin. It was the 0 point, the place where every story begins, where every file created, and where nothing is ever truly deleted as long as someone is there to remember it. The world was heavy. The world was glitchy. The world was finally, perfectly incomplete. I leaned back, adjusted my sights, and began my first watch of the new eternity.